Load the side cannons and prepare the rites of banishment. Today we're talking Grey Knights in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Grey Knights, and we're going to be talking about these demon hunting space marines of Titan and how they play on the board in 40k at the moment. In the video we'll go over their current army performance and strengths and weaknesses, their core rules and perhaps some of the strongest rules from each of their codex's sections, the psychic brotherhoods that you can choose from, the various different units and how strong they are right now, touch briefly on allies, and then go over one example army list. Loads to talk about, so let's talk force weapons and psi steel armor and jump straight into it. So first up, currently in 40k, Grey Knights are maybe having a little bit of a harder time than most. Initially when their codex dropped, they were very strong indeed, an all-round psychic powerhouse faction that both dealt a lot of damage in the psychic phase, but also had a lot of raw might to back it up with just very strong datasheets like the Nemesis Dread Knights and the Grandmasters. Back that up with a whole bunch of punchy infantry with a flurry of Stormbolter fire, and he had a recipe for success. Since then though, a fair few other strong codexes have come out, plenty of their rivals have been buffed, and the Grey Knights themselves have taken a few choice nerfs. Dread Knights went up in cost, as did Inceptors. You can't spam Grandmaster Dread Knights anymore, though they did gain Armour of Contempt, which certainly helped out things like Paladins. Currently their win rate around about 43% in tournament games in Nephilim, that is below average by a decent chunk. They could certainly be an army that Games Workshop tries to buff a little bit in future points updates or balanced data slates. They really aren't being played all that much in tournaments either, very low play rates of around about 3% of tournament lists, and what's more, as best I can tell they haven't won any big tournaments in Nephilim whatsoever, when most of the other factions have bagged at least one. I wouldn't say it's all doom and gloom though, they are certainly behind the power curve a little bit, but can still compete solidly with the majority of the mid-tier factions. Their codex definitely has its advantages, certainly a powerful psychic phase with mortal wounds and plenty of other tricks. They play in all three phases of the game, which is pretty nice. Dealing damage in psychic, shooting, and then assaulting does mean that they have a lot of options on the table and can generally meet up to enemy threats in the way that they choose. There's quite a lot of teleport and deep striking tricks within the codex. Most of the army can deep strike, and then you can port them around the board with teleport shunts, Gate of Infinity, and the Sigil of Exigence, meaning that even though they're fairly slow once they're ground bound on the board, they can still get where they need to. Tides of the Warp is certainly a very helpful mechanic as well. Decent defense from light cover and switching it up for bigger melee damage if that makes more sense. As for weaknesses, their codex does have at least a relatively small unit selection compared with most. They are quite elite and struggle for some battlefield roles, particularly they don't really do long range fire support very much. Perhaps their best firepower heavy lifters are the Nemesis Dread Knights, and even they're quite short ranged at 24 inches. I feel like as a faction in general, they're perhaps quite weak to damage 2 weapons, which are really quite spammed in 40k in general. They're very effective both against Dread Knights and their troops, and a lot of their units will fall apart if anything too nasty is directed against them. Plus, while they are quite a good counter-psychic army in themselves with boost to deny and mortal wound protection, anything that counters psychic on the other side of the table is still going to annoy them a lot. They rely on mortal wounds from psychic powers for at least a chunk of their damage, and any armies that have access to decent psychic denial is going to put a spanner in the works. Maybe Tyrannies and Sisters of Battle perhaps are some of the better examples there. Overall, I'd say they're not the easiest army to win with in 40k right now, but they're certainly not bad, and a fair leg up compared with some of the weaker factions in the game, perhaps generic Codex Space Marines, Admech, and Astra Militarum at the moment. Getting into their codex rules, first up we have the core faction rules, a bunch of stuff that's present on quite a lot of datasheets. Armour of Contempt is a semi-recent balanced data slate edition, giving you +1 save for any of your non-Dread Knight units whenever they're attached with a weapon with AP. It's particularly nice on the Terminators who already have a 2+ save to begin with, and it stacks very nicely with Tide of Shadows or Armoured Resilience, both of which further increase saves to mean that you've got a very tanky model on your hands. You really can make Paladin squads into pretty unyielding anvils. The Knights of Titan special rule grants them and they shall know no fear, so slightly better leadership there. Bolter Discipline, which is good for all the Stormbolters that are in there in the army. Quite nice to have Terminators rapid firing them at 24 inches. And Tides of the Warp, their pure army special rule, which we'll get onto in just a second. On top of that, the majority of the units can teleport strike as well. It's often not the worst idea to keep 1 or 2 units in deep strike just to hit the enemy where they most need to, or potentially threaten a long charge on something that really can't afford to be engaged. Generally in 9th edition it's not wise to go too mad on putting everything in deep strike reserve though, better to have most things start on the table, and Grey Knights do have ways that you could potentially jump things up turn 1 with Gate of Infinity or Teleport Shunt. As their kind of equivalent of a chapter tactic, they get the Aegis, a 5+ save against mortal wounds, which really is quite nice. A ton of things do mortal wounds in 9th edition, and this is really quite good against quite a lot of armies now. They also get a +1 to deny the witch, and lots of psychers with which to do so. That does give you some pretty good coverage against certain armies that are reliant on them. Maybe a double-edged sword though, because other psychic armies are going to be trying to deny you back. Finally, and kind of intrinsic to the faction, is that just about every unit that's an infantry unit or character is a psyker, and even a couple of the vehicles like the dreadnoughts and the dreadknights. It does give them the weakness of being shot down potentially, but it means that most of your squads can at least belt out a few mortal wounds if they need to. And plus I quite like the mechanic that these sanctic powers from Grey Knights can be cast multiple times at increasing cost. It means that you don't have too much diminishing returns on having multiple squads with the same psychic power. Going back to their Tides of the Warp, the Master of the Warp special rule is the Grey Knight's Pure Army rule. That's the one that you get if you don't take any other Imperial allies along, barring things like Agents of the Imperium. You get to choose one of the tides to start in, and from there you can switch it out with the Warp Shaping power, which is usually one that's useful to have on a safe-ish character, so you could potentially switch it up during the game if you wanted to. In my opinion, I feel like the Tide of Shadows and Tide of Convergence are generally the ones that you're usually going to want to choose between. The Tide of Shadows is the range damage protection one, light cover at range, or dense cover if you happen to be already in light cover. The light cover itself works very nicely with Armour of Contempt and makes them a lot harder to kill, and it's potentially quite nice a one to start in if you think that you're going to have at least some units exposed and are going to be taking some shooting damage turn 1. Obviously it's not that relevant against every army though. If you're playing basically a list that's entirely assault, then you're not really going to want this. Otherwise there's the Tide of Convergence. That's the one where in melee your wound rolls of a 6 do a single mortal wound, empowering those Nemesis Force weapons to be a lot more deadly. On top of that you also get an extra 6-inch range to your psi weapons too. Really quite a meaningful boost if you say playing with Dread Knights and you've got the 24-inch range guns on them. I'd say that'd be my other top pick. Getting a bunch of mortal wounds whenever you fight in melee is pretty nice, and the mortal wounds do particularly well with the Hammer Hand spell if you happen to use it on Strike Marines. Otherwise, I feel like the others are all usable but more niche. The Tide of Celerity gives you a small movement boost. Each dice that you roll on advance and charge rolls never counts as less than a 3. It seems handy enough if your army is going to be doing a lot of advancing. Potentially could be one for a first turn if the Tide of Shadows isn't worth it, or potentially towards the end of the game if all that matters is just eking out that extra few inches of movement towards objectives. Still though, I feel like most of the time you're going to be better off with more mortal wounds or light cover. The Tide of Escalation is one that allows you to cast Brotherhood powers multiple times and increase the cost of each cast like you do with the Sanctic or with Smite. Again, that was not unusable, but I feel like you're giving up quite a lot to be able to do that. You really have to have a very specific strategy in mind, spamming a Brotherhood psychic power, and I'm honestly not 100% convinced that pretty much any of them are worth it to be cast loads of times across the board, at least when you're trading off for the powers that those units would have cast anyway. I feel that one's a bit niche, but maybe one turn it might make sense. Finally, there's a Tide of Banishment. This one allows you to reroll 1s to hit and wound against demons, and gives an aura of -2 leadership for them. It's a good solid damage boost against their most hated foes. If you are playing Chaos Demons, then it seems like a pretty usable one, though it's not exactly going to be relevant in most games. Unfortunately, at least by tournament stats, it looks like Grey Knights get absolutely crushed by Chaos Demons, unfortunately. They are pretty well one of the top tier armies in the game, but still maybe feels a bit sad for one of the matchups that Grey Knights probably should be doing quite well. In any case though, overall for Tides of the Warp, I'd be tempted to start in Tide of Shadows, particularly if your opponent's got a decent amount of shooting that doesn't ignore cover, and then perhaps as you're about to hit melee, change to the Tide of Convergence with Warp Shaping, and then put this back down with some melee might. I feel like it's perhaps worth talking about the psychic powers early, seeing as they're so intrinsic to the codex. The Grey Knights have 2 psychic disciplines, Dominus that goes on the characters, and Sanctic that goes on the individual squads. Each squad gets an assigned psychic power. Paladins get to choose 2 of them, and also the Librarians can take Sanctic as well. The Dominus discipline I think is a really good one. I think most of the time it makes sense to have most of those powers in play somewhere in your army, and to be honest, by taking a few HQs you're kind of likely to. Gate of Infinity allows you to teleport a Psychic unit anywhere that's greater than 9 inches from the enemy. Great mobility on that. You could do that to, say, a Grandmaster Nemesis Dread Knight and get some lines of sight on shoot something, then attempt to charge, or just teleport a unit onto a far-flung objective and start getting points. Really nice to reposition for the army and get units in or out of danger. Empiric Amplification is a really powerful boost. You get +1 damage for Nemesis and Psi weapons against the target that's marked. It's pretty massive if you're just about to charge the enemy unit with a big scary melee unit of your own, Going up to, say, 3 damage swords is pretty nasty on things like Terminators. Can be very nice if you have a squadron of Dreadknights as well, and opening up with their psi weapons. Warp shaping, we've already mentioned, allows you to switch out of tides, say between shadows and convergence, generally useful to have somewhere. Vortex of Doom is a big mortal wound one, 2d3 mortal wounds to the nearest unit within 12 inches, and then 1 mortal wound to anything within 3 inches. If you get that off, that could easily be an average of something like 6 mortal wounds if you have a couple of enemy units nearby, really big for any one cast. And again, this feels like a very hard one to leave at home, it'd be ideal to have it at least somewhere. Finally, Sanctuary is a 4+ invul save. It's quite nice on the, say, Strike Marines and Interceptors, maybe a bit less relevant on Terminators that already have very good saves plus Armour of Contempt. For the Sanctic Discipline, they're locked to certain squads, and they can be cast multiple times for +1 to cast each time. I feel like perhaps the pick of the bunch are these ones: Hammerhand for reroll wounds in combat, great for strike squads or for Dreadknights, a nice solid combat boost there, and particularly nice with the Tide of Convergence. Armor Resilience gives you +1 to your saves, very nice on Paladins in particular, and particularly nice with the Tide of Shadows. It makes them just have a ridiculously high save that you're not going to cut through unless you've got AP 4 or 5, makes them into a bit of an unmovable anvil. Purifying Flame is quite nice, 3 mortal wounds at 9-inch range, that's quite nice on Librarian damage dealers, and the Purifiers get it, as does Castellan Crow. 3 mortal wounds for a cast is nice, though the range is a little bit prohibitive. Ethereal Castigation is the move-shoot move for Interceptors. If you're not using a Smite or a Brotherhood psychic power and you're not charging, this one seems a bit of a no-brainer. Hopefully move up the board, shoot something, and then zip into cover after using this. Otherwise, I feel like maybe Astral Aim and the other one aren't quite as big a deal, though I guess if you do take a Purgation squad, then Astral Aim is going to get used each turn. Most of your units will also have access to casting Brotherhood psychic powers as well, so that should give you even more options. Some of those are very relevant too. Moving on, we'll talk about some character upgrades. First up, we've got the Warlord Traits, and there's a bunch of usable ones once more. Psychic Epitome is one where you get an extra mortal wound each time you cast a mortal wound dealing spell on the foe. Very nice on a Librarian. Say if you manage to cast both Vortex of Doom and Purifying Flame on a unit, that'd be an average of 9 mortal wounds, and it could be even higher. It means that you can have a Librarian that can basically just delete entire squads if he does get his casts off. Otherwise, Unyielding Anvil's quite a nice one. An Aura of Objective Secured can be quite nice to support Paladins with, or potentially Nemesis Dreadknights with a Grandmaster with it. And perhaps out of the melee ones, there's a few options, but Hammer of Righteousness seems quite nice. +1 to wound in the first round of melee. If you just want a very fighty Grandmaster, then that one will do fine. For Relics, I feel like there's a clear winner out of the codex, which is the Sigil of Exigence. This is the slightly crazy one, where if an enemy unit targets the character that bears this, you can instead opt for that character to just teleport somewhere else on the board, anywhere greater than 9 inches away from the foe. You could put them somewhere that's completely out of line of sight, or potentially even in a threatening position where they could potentially be a threat to an enemy unit next turn. It often means that enemies just won't ever shoot at that model, basically giving you, say, a Grandmaster Nemesis Dreadknight that the enemy just can't afford to shoot, as they're potentially doing you a favour by giving you a free redeploy. It's pretty tempting on other units too, even if you had it on, say, like a Librarian who was deep striking in to do some mortal wounds. Just the idea of him being able to be completely immune from shooting is very nice. Otherwise, I feel like the rest of the relics aren't quite that strong, though there's plenty of usable ones. The Sanctic Shard can allow you to auto-deny powers if you can manage to roll an 8+, that's quite nice. The Artisan Nullifier Matrix allows you to turn off perils within 9 inches. If you've got a solid core to an army that's going to be casting a bunch of powers, that might save you a mortal wound or 2. The Etheric Conduit is quite nice for the Tech Marine, allowing you to repair 3 wounds to a vehicle each turn, quite likely a Dreadnought, and a bunch of the rest are okay, but as said, I feel like few of them really hold up to the sigil. Finally, for character upgrades, we have the Wisdoms of the Prognosticars, a selection of upgrades that basically all function as once per game abilities, and you can give to your non-named characters. I feel like really quite a lot of them are usable, maybe some of them in slightly more niche roles, but perhaps some of the most standout are the Gem of Enoctu for 10 points, a once per game +2 to cast. Say if you have a Librarian that just really wants to be getting its psychic powers off one turn, this 10-point buff does seem pretty reasonable for making sure all that mortal wound damage goes through. The Foretelling of Locust is quite a nice one, a 25-point upgrade that allows you to redeploy 3 core units pre-game. Pre-game redeployment abilities are generally pretty handy. It means that you could get them in a perfect alpha strike position, or shield them from harm if it looks like the opponent's just about to gun them off the table when they get first turn. Kind of lets you have the best of both worlds deployment-wise. Finally, the Servant of the Throne is 15 points. This one's a very solid durability upgrade in your model's time of need, quite often taken on Nemesis Dread Knight Grandmasters, and it gives you a 3+ invul save that you can trigger when you're about to take damage, and then it lasts until the end of the turn. It can just make a very valuable model incredibly hard to kill, and it raises the value of command point re-rolling a failed save, as you're a bit more likely to pass it on 3+ than say a 4+. Out of the Wisdoms, I feel like they're probably my favourite 3 for the value. Several of the others are very usable, including giving heroic interventions, better overwatch, or objective secured for a turn, but they do kind of feel like luxury picks, and I do feel that you pay quite a chunk of points for them. Stratagems next, and here are just a few of the slightly more generic ones that help out the army as a whole, as opposed to things that are tied to certain units. Teleport Shunt I think is a really nice one, a 2 CP ability to basically just teleport a keyworded unit somewhere across the board. Very nice for interceptors and things. It can help just getting them where they need to be for shooting or killing the enemy. It can potentially be helpful late game as well, say if you're going for objectives, maybe trying to clear an enemy home objective or do a retrieve data action in their own deployment zone. Fight on the Move is 1 CP and it allows you to fall back and shoot and charge with a teleport unit. Very nice for interceptors jumping up the board, and if you take the upgrade, then it means that you can't pin down that Dread Knight in combat very easily either. There's a bunch of different stratagems for manipulating the psychic phase, a 1 CP for an extra cast, a 1 CP for casting on 3d6 and dropping the lowest this turn, and a 1 CP for an extra 6-inch range. That last one particularly nice for the librarian with Purifying Flame maybe. Any of those can be pretty handy. The extra cast one can be quite nice for the squads as well. Say if you had a strike squad that wanted to do hammer hand and then maybe also cast say the rapier's power for an extra attack. There's also 1 CP for Cybolt ammo, 6s to hit auto wound with bolters and gain AP -1. Say if you had an interceptor squad in a key position that could really up the damage against a light infantry unit, really make sure that they kill something and then hopefully charge something else. And it's 2 or 3 CP for Transhuman Physiology, True Silver Armor on the Stratagem section here. A bit more expensive than Primaris Space Marines, but potentially if you do have a squad that's just about to get hit by an awful lot of Strength 8 weapons, then it might well be worth it even at the increased price. Plenty of other good things for the squads themselves though, say for example the Purifiers and their -1 damage stratagem. Moving on to Secondaries, and the Grey Knights do have quite a nice one in Purifying Ritual. I feel like that's going to be one that most armies are going to take in most games, though sometimes it might matter a little bit as to how many objectives you've got easy access to. I'd still say it's usually going to be the best secondary out there out of the 3 Grey Knight ones. The game is to try and do psychic actions on multiple different points, and if you can do it on 3 then you get 4 victory points. It's 2 for 2 and 1 for 1. It just seems like a secondary objective that provided you can hold one objective all game long, you're pretty much guaranteed 5 points, and you're almost certainly going to score far higher than that if you can do it with multiple different units. Could maybe combine alright with Raise the Banners as well, if you do have a fair few units to stand around doing actions before jumping towards the foe. Otherwise, there's Teleport Assault as probably the next best. I think it's usable but a bit mediocre. The game for this one is to kill enemy units with one of your units that either deep struck, used a teleport shunt or Gate of Infinity, so basically was set up on the board and then deals damage. Each turn that you manage to do that, it's 4 victory points, though I feel like it's maybe just a bit dependent on maybe killing things with psychic or shooting, as usually you're not going to have any sort of reliable charge out of Deep Strike. If that unit that happens to have done the jump maneuver does roll a bit cold and doesn't quite finish off their target though, it could be quite punishing, and there could be big swings on just a little bit of bad luck. Still though, maybe if the enemy has literally no other kill objectives on offer, then perhaps that one could be an option. Finally, there's Destroy the Demon, fairly solid against demons themselves, as it's basically about killing demon monsters, vehicles, and Primarchs if possible. Against any sort of demon army, again, I feel like it's going to be one that you're going to struggle to score too low with, provided you're actually killing at least a fair few units over the course of the game. It's perhaps not particularly helpful though to have one of the 3 faction-specific secondaries only really relevant in 1 or 2 matchups. Chaos Demons, of course, maybe Death Guard at a push if they've used a load of demon engines. Overall for secondaries, I'd take Purifying Ritual most of the time, maybe Teleport Assault as a fallback choice if there isn't something better on offer. Next up we come to the Psychic Brotherhoods, and it's kind of interesting to see how these have gone in and out of fashion over the past year or so since the codex released. On the codex drop, a lot of people were playing sword bearers with spamming loads of dread knights, but now they went up a bit in cost and you can't spam grandmasters, they have fallen away a bit and aren't played quite as much. For competitive lists, people generally seem to be debating between the Prescient Brethren and Rapiers for the most part. The Prescient Brethren appear to make up the greatest proportion of tournament lists, though not by much, and like all the Brotherhoods they get you a Stratagem, a Psychic Power, and a Warlord Trait. The Stratagem's quite a nice one, 1 CP to reroll 1s to hit and wound for a unit, really quite solid extra damage, usually that's going to equate to around about 35% on whatever damage you had before, usually quite good on a threatening unit. Fatal Precognition is a fairly fun Witchfire type spell, where you don't actually deal any damage initially, but if they decide to move or charge, then they both have chances to take mortal wounds when they do so. Can just mess with enemy plans a bit, if they're trying to charge you down perhaps, but then some of their squad might evaporate as they're trying to close the gap. I feel like the Divination Warlord trait is okay as well. You basically have the option to do a psychic action for a command point. Having a model that can just sit there and spam command points out most of the game while doing whatever else they need to do really is quite nice. I feel like that could be okay for something like a chaplain that's also doing litanies, or perhaps an apothecary that's doing apothecary things with paladins. Otherwise, the rapiers are a heavy combat one. They are also in big representation as well. They do have a warlord trait to advance and charge, but I feel like the best things are the stratagem and the psychic power. 1 CP for exploding 6s to hit in melee, and a psychic power that allows them to get +1 attack. Both of those are really nice. The extra attack one is quite nice for interceptors in particular, seeing as they don't have a combat boost psychic power unlike the Strike Marines. If you want your Grey Knights to just be dealing as much damage as possible in combat though, then this Brotherhood's the one to go for. Otherwise, even though they have gone a little bit less popular, I still feel that the Sword Bearers are very strong indeed. If you want to spam Dread Knights, then that's the Brotherhood to do so. I'd say the best thing about them is their psychic power, where you can mark one target, and then all of your vehicle shooting gets +1 to wound against it, which is really brutal if you're focusing the firepower of multiple Dread Knights with the side cannons and the silencers on it. Between that and perhaps Ethereal Castigation, you can just have one target very, very dead. They do also have a 2 CP stratagem for all vehicles to get +1 to hit against one unit. Again, that's a fairly decent enough damage boost if you've already got lots of buffs going on. At 2 CP though, I don't think it's exactly auto-include, you'd have to have multiple units buffed by that for it to be worth it. Otherwise, going down the list, the Blades of Victory allow you a reroll charge spell, and they've got a nice pre-game move Warlord Traits, which could be quite good for getting onto midfield objectives early. They do have a small damage increasing stratagem as well, where when they charge in, they have a chance to deal mortal wounds. Otherwise, out of the rest, I feel like the Preservers are another fairly interesting one. This one gets you a decent apothecary that can grant a 5+ feel no pain to a unit. They do have to cast the psychic power to activate that though. And they can also give a +3-inch range to auras out to someone. Again, that could be handy on an apothecary. Otherwise, the Ward Makers have some good stuff. A special character access for Voldus and Stern, plus reliable casting with a Warlord trait, and the option to swap out powers for 1 CP, which is actually quite handy. The Exactor's main thing is perhaps the really big Mortal Wound anti-horde spell if they choose not to fall back from you, and a 1 CP heroic intervention army-wide, also nice. And I feel like maybe the Silver Blades are perhaps the most underwhelming, fall back and shoot, and firing bolters in melee, neither of which are dreadful, but generally the Storm Bolters aren't the thing that's carrying the codex, it's more about the melee. In general though, maybe Prescient Brethren for a balanced list, Rapiers for a melee heavy one, and Sword Bearers if you want to spam Dread Knights or try and get some use out of the rest of the Grey Knight motor pool. Moving on to the units of the codex next, and first up we'll start with the infantry. Generally you're going to be wanting troops to fill out battalions, and your choice is Strike Marines or Terminators. I think currently the Strike Marines still make more sense, even though the Terminators had more use out of Armour of Contempt and did go down in cost a bit since the codex came out. Strike Marines are just very efficient, the core of most armies, hit very hard with Hammer Hand for the cost that they have, and are perhaps quite nice units to camp on home field objectives for a bunch of the game, maybe doing that psychic action a few times, and then if the enemy does get too close to them and tries to take the objective off them, then they have the potential for a very nasty counter charge, even more so when buffed. You could also use small units of them deep striking as well. I'd be most tempted to take the Nemesis Force Swords on them. They're really quite nice with Hammer Hand, with their lower strength being a bit less important. I feel like if I were to take Terminators, I would be taking Paladins, not regular ones. Otherwise, out of the other sections, I feel like the Interceptors and the Paladins are the standout choices. Interceptors are basically Strike Marines but faster. They do swap out Hammer Hand for Ethereal Castigation, but they're really quite nice for actually getting to objectives and putting those scary force weapons to work, plus with Smite and some Storm Bolter fire to back it up. Having the teleport keyword's quite nice for stratagems and things, and they work pretty well with either swords or halberds. Really quite a common unit to be doing the heavy lifting in a Grey Knight codex. Perhaps the biggest weakness is they're just not all that tough for the cost if they do get shot. Otherwise, you've got the Paladins, which I have mentioned a few times already. They can just be ridiculously tanky with Armor of Contempt, a 2+ save, and then Armored Resilience, maybe stacked with light cover, either from terrain or the Tide of Shadows. They could be well supported with an Apothecary to heal them and potentially resurrect slain models with a Stratagem, and maybe give the Obsec trait to them as well. I've seen a fair few people run Ethereal Castigation as the second spell on them from Sanctic. That seems quite a nice one for actually getting them a bit more mobility, essentially giving them move, shoot, move up the board if they don't need the extra toughness from Armored Resilience. Perhaps their biggest weakness is not getting the Brotherhood traits. It does lock them out of a few synergies. Otherwise, Servitors can be fairly handy to have around. It still seems that a number of Grey Knight competitive lists do tend to use them. Just 30 points for a very cheap unit that could potentially sit on an objective and be ignored. They perhaps have more use in Grey Knights than most other places, as the smaller squad of Grey Knight troops cost 110 points, and if you can manage to get one of their jobs done with a 30-point unit, you might free up more points to go and smash the enemy. I feel like Purifiers aren't bad, and are just maybe overlooked because they're just not quite as necessary sometimes. They get really quite a nice Mortal Wound spell with Purifying Flame, and perhaps just as importantly, if not more, is their -1 damage stratagem. Having access to that can actually make them surprisingly tanky, as if you hit them with a 2 damage weapon, then it basically doubles their toughness. Could be an interesting one to load into a Rhino maybe, though I feel like a lot of people just pass them up for Paladins or Interceptors, and would rather just fill Strike Marines instead to fill out the troop slots as they have OBSEC. Out of the Grey Knight infantry units, I feel like the Purgation Squad are the ones that Games Workshop have perhaps not quite costed right. Their damage is okay, you could deep strike them with some Incinerators perhaps, or try and go heavy on the Stratagems and make their Psy Cannons or Silencers work, but them being heavy really isn't ideal to be honest, and I feel like the supporting Stratagems just cost a few more CP than I'd really expect. I'd argue probably the weakest out of the units on this list. Overall, I feel for infantry units you can't really go too wrong with 3 small units of Strike Marines in the troops, and then back that up with as many Interceptors and Paladins as you can fit into a list. Next up, we've got the vehicles. Grey Knights are kind of infantry and character heavy, being far better with units with psychic synergies rather than gun tanks or anything. But out of the vehicles, I feel like the most relevant ones are the Dread Knights and their transports. If you want vehicles that deal damage, I feel like the Dread Knights are easily the best there. Just very nice generalist all-rounders, a bunch of volume fire with silencers and psy cannons, solid melee with their greatsword, a little bit of psychic, and being reasonably fast and reasonably tough on top of all that. As mentioned, probably best used in Sword Bearers for the +1 to wound psychic power, where they can be quite a mighty battle line. As mentioned previously though, since the Armour of Contempt changes, people do seem to have pivoted away from them a bit as a strategy, and are relying more on infantry more than Dread Knights. I still feel that they remain very, very usable though. Just maybe have a few more bad matchups than they did with Armour of Contempt, and Terminators not caring too much about the low AP damage. Otherwise, for transport, I feel like both the Rhino and Razorback are decent enough. Grey Knights have quite a lot of relatively fragile elites for the points. Things like Strike Squads, Purifiers, and even Interceptors can be interesting choices to fill them. It is kind of cool that you can get Interceptors in the transports, as they don't technically have jump pack keywords. The transports aren't really going to do all that much, besides just be an extra few wounds in front of your unit. A cheap Rhino can be nice for some Purifiers or Strike Marines to jump out of as a battlefield bunker though, and if it survives it can go and just sit on objectives or annoy the enemy by blocking movement or charging them. Otherwise, on the slightly weaker end of the scale, I feel like Venerable Dreadnoughts are perhaps kind of not that far off being good, but still seem really quite underpowered compared with Dread Knights at the moment. Maybe not too terrible if you fancy paying a slight premium for long-range fire support with a missile launcher and las cannon, and perhaps if you're playing Sword Bearers for the +1 to wound. Flyers, again, are maybe okay with Sword Bearers. +1 to wound is better than they can get in terms of buffs than most of the Space Marine army, but still I feel like the Space Marine flyers are just kind of overcosted in general. Finally, Land Raiders have issues they do in just about every codex, paying for loads of guns that you then trundle up towards the enemy and might get locked up. Kind of overkill if you want to transport, but not really quite threatening enough for the points cost if you don't. If you did want to go vehicle heavy with Grey Knights, I feel like a trio of Stompy Dread Knights crunching up the board isn't the worst idea. Finally, for the units, we have the Grey Knights roster of characters. I think Games Workshop have done well enough to make the vast majority of them usable, though I feel like perhaps out of the picks that you've got on offer, Caldor Drago, the Librarian, and the Grandmaster and Dread Knight perhaps stick out a bit above the rest. Maybe I should have included the Apothecary in that as well. He is very good with supporting Paladins. Caldor Drago is just a pretty awesome faction leader, costs less than 200 points, Really quite solid melee with high strength and damage 3, a 3+ invul save to keep him safe, 2 casts, so he is going to be contributing to the psychic quite nicely, and giving out 4 rerolls to a unit seems pretty nice for things like strike marines or interceptors, both buffing their shooting and their combat. He is also quite nice in that he gets around the Grandmaster limit, meaning that you could have him plus a Grandmaster and Nemesis Dreadnought as well in the same detachment. The Librarian we've already touched on with Warlord Traits and the Wisdoms and things. They've got access to all the powers in the book, including the Sanctic ones, and can deal some really big mortal wound damage with Vortex of Doom, their Warlord trait for the extra mortal wounds, and perhaps Purifying Flame. Maybe add the Gem of Noctu for that to really guarantee that they punch their damage through. In theory, you can have a Librarian just drop out of reserve, spend 1 CP to increase the range of their powers to 15 so you can cast out of Deep Strike, trigger the Gem of Noctu, and just blast away one enemy unit with an average of around about 9 mortal wounds, plus maybe some splash ones from the Vortex of Doom. Against some armies you might well just be able to pay for his value then and there, and if he is dropping with a little retinue to protect him as well, then he's got a pretty reasonable chance of surviving to do it again. Finally, for perhaps the big 3 choices, we have the Grandmaster in Dreadnought. He's just an all-around powerhouse, being a small upgrade on the regular Dreadnoughts for hitting on 2+ and more attacks, really brutal in combat, casts the Dominus power as well, so you could have Gate of Infinity or Vortex of Doom or something. It's a good place for combat Warlord traits, and a lot of people seem to like running them with the Sigil of Exigence to teleport him away when shot, and maybe the Servant of the Throne as well, meaning that even when the opponent does catch up with him, he's going to be abnormally hard to kill for a turn. Otherwise, for other characters that I think are very usable as well, I'd probably rank the Brotherhood Apothecary next. Paladins really are pretty nice at the moment, very tanky, and can be the core of an army pushing up the board, and having an Apothecary with maybe the Obsec trait and resurrecting them and healing them on tow does seem pretty good. Could be a nice one for any slightly safer Dominus powers as well. Could be an alright one for warp shaping, or perhaps trade out the Obsec for the 1 CP command point spam spell from the Prescient Brethren. Otherwise, running through the rest quickly, Castellan Crow I think is quite good value for 90 points. OK melee, has champion special rules, is fairly cheap, Purifying Flame, and fights on death. I feel like for the extra points over the Brotherhood champion, he by far outcompetes him. The Brotherhood Tech Marine is usable enough with a bunch of Dreadnoughts, heal 1 maybe for 3 flat wounds if you have that relic, plus make one of the Dreadnoughts shoot a little bit straighter, and also gets a Dominus cast as well. The Brotherhood Chaplain gets his choice of the Litanies of Purity. I feel like out of these ones, by far my favourite is the Words of Power. This one gets you extra wounds in combat, and extra mortal wounds if you're in the Tide of Convergence. Perhaps the biggest downside is that it's just a little bit unreliable to cast unless you're willing to spend some big CP. Still though, when that does go off, it'll make one Grey Knight unit hit like an absolute truck. I feel like you could build around a fair few of the rest of the litanies, but I feel like they're not quite as standout as that one. Finally, for options that I think are going to get picked fairly rarely, the Brotherhood Ancient can potentially buff some melee and also hold some Warlord traits. The regular Grandmasters, Brotherhood Captains, and Brotherhood Champions I feel like are usually going to lose out compared with the big chunky Grandmaster and Dreadnought if you do want a Generalist buffing and damage HQ. And both them and the other special characters do seem like they don't really hold much of a candle to the extra value you get from Caldor Drago. Regular Grandmasters and Voldus as well would also compete with fielding Grandmaster Dreadnoughts too, who are very strong. Finally, Voldus and Stern are both locked to the Ward Makers. I feel like Voldus is kind of usable with the extra casts and the big damage 3 hammer. He does compete with those Dreadnought Grandmasters again though. I feel like Stern just really isn't worth it for the extra points over even the Captain. Overall, you still probably don't want to go too character heavy. I feel like you could run all 3 of the top 3, and maybe if you were going very character heavy, you could maybe pick one of the others, perhaps the Apothecary for Paladins, or the Tech Marine for Dreadnoughts. I thought we'd just quickly mention allies as well. Some armies in 40k care a little bit more or less about breaking their pure army special rules, though I feel like in general the Grey Knights care really quite a lot. Losing Tides of the Warp really is quite big for the extra damage and defense it can bring. Plus it really does seem a shame to miss out on the Purifying Ritual secondary. That one's worth a lot of fairly easy victory points in a lot of games. In terms of allies that don't break that, they need to have the Agent of the Imperium keyword, and for most usable things, I feel like Imperial Knights are perhaps the easiest go-to. It would cost you 3 CP for an allied super heavy auxiliary detachment. It's annoying but maybe not unbearable, and probably the easiest choice out of the Knight datasheets might well be the Armiger Helverins. They can add some fast moving objectives secured to a Grey Knight army, plus a whole bunch of long range shooting with damage 3, which they don't have ready access to. They're also quite a good shout for the Hunters of Beast noble tradition. +1 to hit versus monsters and vehicles could give them more damage. Otherwise, if you really did want some knightly allies, you could think about Warglaves or Moiraxes. I feel in general all of the Armiger type units are just a bit more efficient than the big knights, who generally get better when you have relics and warlord traits on them, which you can't get if they're allies. Some aggressive Warglaves could also work quite well, some melter related fire supports, which Grey Knights don't have good AP at range normally. And plus you could take that noble tradition which allows you to attack again with any attacks that don't make it to the inflicts damage step. That one really is a big boost if you're not using sweep mode. Otherwise, I perhaps feel that Inquisitors and Assassins just aren't quite offering quite as much. Grey Knights already have loads of ample psychic defense and casts, so Inquisitors aren't adding a whole load on that front, though a few of them do offer some interesting extra buffs that you might want, and Assassins just aren't super strong at the moment. Not quite worth the price of entry in my opinion. Still could be quite fun for fluff picks though. Grey Knights aren't unknown to work with Inquisitors in the lore. Overall, I'd say that knightly allies could be something that you could look into to shake up a Grey Knight list, but I certainly don't feel that they're mandatory with that 3CP price tag. Finally, I thought we'd just take a look at one example army list that's done quite well in Nephilim, this one by Adam Camilleri, who used it to take second at North and South GT. It looks like it's one of the best performing Grey Knight lists in Nephilim so far. The list is made of a single battalion detachment, as Grey Knight armies often can tend to afford to be, and this one's taking the rapiers, so this one's the one with the option for the extra attacks for a psychic power, and also exploding sixes to hit in melee for 1 CP. Both of those are quite nice for making interceptors in particular more dangerous, which this list has a fair amount of. Leading the list are 2 HQs in a Librarian and Caldor Drago. Both of them take Empiric Amplification, quite an important spell for making all the melee into damage 3 against a target, which is pretty big. And the Librarian also takes Vortex of Doom for some big mortal wounds, plus the Gem of Enoch 2 for a powerful psychic phase. Caldor Drago will be really nice for giving some big rerolls to a unit. Maybe it could be nice on the Paladin squad in particular. A big tanky unit of 10 of them with rerolling all hits does seem pretty strong. Besides Empiric Amplification, he's also got Sanctuary for a 4+ Invul. Could be nice on some of those interceptors running around, and also Gate of Infinity to teleport a unit across the board. Then, as another character in the elite slot, they also have a Brotherhood Apothecary. He takes Warp Shaping, the Unyielding Anvil Obsec trait, and Foretelling of Locust, the redeploy one, so you could change up where you put down your units. He's likely going to be there with that big brick of 10 paladins, giving them all obsec, and basically making one objective a no-go for your opponent. Then getting into the squads themselves, there's 3 strike squads, all armed with the swords. Likely could be good choices for doing the psychic action, maybe sitting back on home field objectives, and being quite a meaty melee counterpunch if they're there. They could potentially deep strike if needed as well. There's then 2 units of 10 interceptors, 1 unit takes swords, 1 takes halberds. They could potentially combat squad if needed, and even these guys can be pretty hard hitting in melee with the rapiers options, plus other buffs like Empiric Amplification. There's then 2 units of cheap servitors, could be interesting for maybe doing raise the banner type actions, or just holding down home field objectives if the strike squads need to go up and be aggressive. I guess could be potentially handy for retrieving data as well if you go for that secondary. Then there's a whole bunch of paladins, 13 of them to be precise, 10 of them with swords in a great big blob. They take Armoured Resilience, which I suspect they'd want most of the time in the open to just make them fantastically durable, and they also have Ethereal Castigation, which mean that they could move, shoot, move, and get up the board a lot quicker if that makes more sense. If they do get shot down as well, you could potentially use the Apothecary's Stratagem to heal one and set one up closer to the enemy. That could give you a big shorter distance on charge ranges. Finally, there's another 3 paladins with Armoured Resilience and Ethereal Castigation. Not sure if their plan would just be to go the same way or go for a lesser objective. And finally 1 Rhino. I guess that could theoretically transport either the Interceptors or the Strike Squads. Not sure how it was used in this list. In any case, to give either one of those a bit of extra protection and also get them up the board quicker for a battlefield bunker to jump out of. Overall, a really solid looking list. Loads of chunky OBSEC models to take those primaries. Plenty of units to run around doing actions and psychic actions for secondaries, a bunch of mortal wounds, and some very dangerous melee with the rapiers things. Looks like a very good example of what Grey Knights can bring to the table at the moment. So I think we'll leave that there for today. Hope you've enjoyed a rough overview of Grey Knights in 9th edition and some of their strongest options that they can bring to the board at the moment. As always, please correct me if I've made any errors or if there's any particularly juicy strategies that I've left out of this. Always interesting to hear how you can make better use of certain units. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k content coming. I do generally tend to post 40k videos every day. Finally, if you have been getting good value out of my videos, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down in the video description if you're interested in helping support. The channel's Patreon is what allows me to focus on making great big long videos like this quite so often, and making 40k videos as my main thing. If you are enjoying a lot, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages as well, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.